One of the hardest things about a new generation of gaming is getting used to the new controllers. And this time around, PlayStation has the more interesting iteration of controllers, and since they released 2 weeks ahead of the PS5, I thought, why not get one and give it a feel for myself? But first off, before we even talk about the DualSense itself, we have to talk about some of the comparisons to the DualShock 4. The DualShock 4 has become so normal to me over the past 7 years that it's so odd going from something like that to the Xbox One or even the Switch Pro controller. I've never looked into things too much until recently, but the more I've been using the DualSense controller, the more I'm starting to prefer these bigger controller sizes. Because hey, I'm a big dude, I got big hands, and these big hands on this controller, it just feels right. It feels very comfortable. It feels like it is just made for me. Now, going into this video, I have to be transparent. Of course, I do not have a PS5 to test out the PS5 features with this controller, so I can't get a very good sense of how the adaptive triggers work or the haptic feedback, but I did get a good feel for the controllers as I did play some PC games for about roughly 10 hours. And my reason for doing that is to see how this controller holds up over time. Because obviously it does take a little bit to get used to a new controller. It takes a bit of playing around and just getting used to the way it feels. And as you get into those longer play sessions, obviously the controller could feel more comfortable or less comfortable based on the design of it. But again, one thing I have to add, although it's definitely not anything at all against the controller itself, I did have a few issues connecting this controller to my PC. And I don't mean about connecting it in terms of the Bluetooth or just hooking it up through USB-C. I mean in terms of using this controller with specific games. I've actually done a little bit of research and I've seen that there are ways of getting around this, some of which are a little bit more technical than others, but I will link one of those videos in the description if you want to have a method of connecting the DualSense to your PC and having those extra controller options. But I'm not entirely sure if it's anything to do with the way the games are optimized or if it needs drivers to work better, but it is definitely a minor issue and nothing that has to do with the way the controller feels. What I did at first was focus on some platformer games that took advantage of the D-pad and face buttons just to get a feel of how those worked. The face buttons in comparison to the DualShock 4 definitely have less of a clicky sound to them, and for lack of a better term, they don't feel like they jostle around as much inside the casing as much as the DualShock 4 does. And that's not to say that they feel stiff, but it's an overall more solid feel to them. And for someone like myself who likes to button mash in a lot of fighting games, the clickiness going away is definitely a nice feature. But moving on to the buttons on the back of the controller in comparison, obviously I couldn't take advantage of the adaptive trigger features, but one thing very much stood out to me in comparison to the DualShock 4 just playing with this controller in general. These triggers, these back buttons are thick, and I mean they are chunky in comparison to the DualShock 4. And again, for someone with big hands like myself, I love this sort of thing because it makes the buttons more pronounced. And especially for a more beefy design, something that's more weighty, it adds a bit more grip while you play your games. The best way I thought of to try out the triggers for myself was to boot up some GTA and do some driving and shooting. And I honestly have to say it just feels so much more comfortable in comparison to the DualShock 4. And having these buttons be so much larger in comparison is a good thing because with the DualShock 4, I sometimes felt like I was going to press both of the back buttons at the same time because of how close together they were and how small they were in comparison. And the last feature I want to test for myself is something that surprisingly works without having the PS5 at all. And as a matter of fact, while we talk about this feature, I thought why not do it a bit differently. Instead of me explaining it to you, you can actually hear it for yourself. So right now you're hearing this part of my impressions from the microphone on the DualSense controller. Instead of me giving my opinions on it straight up, I'm just going to let this recording do all of the talking for me. I do have to admit it's a great addition for those people who have the excuse of never having a headset to talk in online games, but for many like myself, I don't think I'm ever going to use it. I can see maybe if I got lazy and didn't feel like putting on the entire headset to talk with my friends, but enough of that, let's just get right back into the video. The main thing I love about this controller is the fact that Sony is going with the status quo and going with a larger form factor for the controller. And even outside of the form factor, the controller itself just feels very sturdy and the build quality is absolutely amazing. For a controller to add all these extra features and benefits, it's definitely worth the $70 price tag, and even just for playing on PC, it's not that bad at all. Now of course, in comparison, an Xbox controller will always be more optimized for playing games on Windows, but when the DualSense worked, I enjoyed every comfortable second of playing with it. So that about wraps up my little review impressions of the DualSense controller. Obviously, we'll all see for ourselves how this controller really holds up with the haptic feedback and the adaptive triggers when it's in the hands of the public later on this week. So tell me all your thoughts in the comment section down below and let me know what you think about the DualSense controller and if you're excited for the PlayStation 5. And also don't forget to follow me on Twitter so we can talk more about these things. And that is all for today, so I'll see you guys in the next one.